everyone. So today I will be doing range of motion measurements for shoulder flexion. First, client's position. She is positioned in standing, hand in neutral, and adducted, which is to the side. You want to find the head of the humerus in order to do that. You find the clavicle and then the superior border of the scapular. From there, you're going to find the head of the acromion, which is around about here, and then about 1.5 inches down, where there's a little dip, that's going to be your head of the humerus. So you want to get your goniometer, and you want to put the fulcrum at the axis point and take your first measurement. So once it's lined up, my first measurement here is at 0. I'm going to put my hand back at the axis point, stabilize the trunk. All right, go ahead and raise your arm up towards the ceiling. Up towards the ceiling, very good. Definitely you don't want to lose your axis point, but right now I'm behind her, so I need to come more interior. So I'm going to go ahead and put my goniometer right here. The stationary bar will be parallel to the trunk. The movable bar proximal to the humerus. And I'm going to go ahead and remove my goniometer and go ahead and relax your arm, please. My first measurement for shoulder flexion is about 173 degrees. Okay, so shoulder flexion is normally 0 to 170. I get a 0 to 173 degrees. Thank you. Range of motion measurements for horizontal abduction. First thing, patient's position, client position in standing, humerus abducted to 90 degrees, palms facing down. All right, so next thing, finding the bony landmark. So the bony landmark will be the superior acromion process. So the superior acromion process will be at the top of the shoulder, okay? And how you find that, basically you would locate the clavicle and then the superior border of the scapular in order to find the acromion process. So once I find that, I'm going to go ahead and retrieve my goniometer because I found my axis point. I am going to apply the fulcrum of the goniometer at the axis point. So the stationary part of the goniometer will be towards the neck, and then the movable bar will be parallel to the humerus. I'm going to remove the goniometer and keep my hand on the axis point and do my first reading. Go ahead and bring your hand down. So my first reading is at about 5 degrees of abduction. All right, so go ahead and raise your arm up, and you're going to turn your arms towards your body, all the way towards your body. So I still have my hand on the axis point. So I'm going to go ahead and reapply the goniometer. Reposition it here. Okay, and then the movable bar will be parallel, as I said, to the humerus. All right, so I am going to have you relax, and I'm going to say what my reading is. So my reading is at 85 degrees of abduction. The general reading for horizontal abduction is 0 to 130. So the client right now, she's at 85 degrees. Thank you. Hello everyone. So today I will be doing shoulder add and abduction. So first thing is to position the client Client positioned in standing, humerus adducted, and forearm in supinated. So what I need to do, I need to find the posterior aspects of the acromion process. In order to do that, first thing, I will locate the clavicle and the superior border of the scapular to find the head of the acromion process. Once I find the head of the acromion process, about 1.5 inches down, I am going to locate the head of the humerus, and I need to actually bring my hand a little further back to find the posterior aspects of the humerus. Once I find that, I definitely do not want to lose my axis point. I am going to retrieve my goniometer, place the fulcrum of the goniometer on the axis point, and I am going to go ahead and take my first measurement. So with this measurement, the stationary bar is actually parallel to the trunk, and the movable bar is parallel to the humerus. And my first measurement is 15 degrees of abduction. Alright, so what I'm going to do, I still have my axis point back here. I am going to stabilize the humerus, and I am going to ask my client to raise her arm all the way up towards the side. Okay, so now I can stop the stabilization. So I'm going to remove my hand. Still have my hand at the axis point. Reapply the goniometer. As I said before, the stationary bar is parallel to the trunk, and the movable bar is proximal to the humerus. All right, bring your arms down. And my reading is at 160 degrees of shoulder abduction. Thank you. Range of motion measurements for shoulder extension / flexion. Generally 0 to 135 to 150. First thing, position. Client positioned in standing, humerus adducted, forearm supinated. Next, find the bony landmark. So the bony landmark is the lateral epicondyle. Once I find my bony landmark and my axis point, I'm going to go ahead and retrieve my goniometer. And I'm going to apply my goniometer at the axis point. All right, so the stationary bar is parallel to the humerus, and the movable bar is parallel to the radius. Okay, and my first measurement is at 0 degrees. Okay, so I am going to put my hand under here just so that I do not lose my axis point. And I'm going to stabilize the humerus, and I'm going to go ahead and ask the client to flex your arm. So bend your elbow all the way up as far as you can. So my hand is still here. I'm gonna reapply the goniometer. I'm going to have you bring your arm down, and I'm going to remove the goniometer. Okay. And my reading is, I'm getting 158 degrees of elbow flexion. Thank you. Measurements for shoulder internal rotation, which is generally 0 to 60 degrees. First, position. Client is positioned in standing, humerus adducted, elbow at 90 degrees, forearm at midpoint position. Next, I want to find my bony landmark, which is the ulcranian process of the elbow. So I'm going to go ahead, find my bony landmark. I'm going to go ahead and put the fulcrum of the goniometer on the bony landmark. So both the stationary bar and the movable bar are parallel to the forearm. My first reading is at 0 degrees. So you definitely do not want to lose your bony landmarks. I'm going to actually keep my finger here. I'm going to stabilize proximal to the joint being measured. And then I'm going to go ahead and ask you to move your hand all the way in towards your body. All right. So now the stabilization of my hand is no longer needed. So I'm going to remove my hand. Make sure you keep your finger on the axis point. And I'm going to go ahead and place the fulcrum of the goniometer on the joint being measured. Now the stationary bar is parallel to the trunk and the movable bar goes towards the forearm. All right, I'm going to remove the goniometer for my second reading. And my second reading is at 65 degrees. General internal rotation is 0 to 60, but in this case, she measured at 65 degrees. Measurements for shoulder external rotation. First, client's positioned. She's positioned in standing, humerus adducted, elbow at 90 degrees, forearm at midpoint position. Next, you want to find your bony landmark, which is the ulcranian process of the elbow. All right, so I am going to go ahead and put my goniometer on the axis point. Both the stationary bar and the movable bar is perpendicular to the forearm. And my first reading here is at 0 degrees. You want to make sure you keep your hand on the axis point. Then what I'm going to do next, I'm going to go ahead and stabilize proximal to the joint being measured. And I'm going to go ahead and ask you to bring your hand towards me. Bring your forearm towards me as far as you can. Okay, all right. So I'm going to go ahead and retrieve my goniometer for my measurement. So the stationary bar at this point, it's perpendicular to the trunk. The movable bar should be in alignment with the forearm. Okay, and my reading is 50 degrees of external rotation. Range of motion measurements for shoulder horizontal abduction. First, client positioned in standing. Okay, humerus will be abducted at 90 degrees, elbow in extension, hand facing down. Next, I want to find my bony landmark, which is the superior aspects of the acromion process. Once I find my bony landmark, I am going to go ahead and place my goniometer. The stationary bar will be towards the neck, and the movable bar will be parallel to the humerus. And my first reading here is about 5 degrees of adduction. So next, I want to go ahead and stabilize proximal to the joint being measured. I'm going to go ahead and stabilize the trunk, and I'm going to go ahead and ask you to move your hand back towards me. Okay. All right, stabilization is no longer needed, so I'm going to go ahead and move my hand. Keep my hand on the axis point. Reapply the goniometer. Stationary bar towards the neck. Movable bar parallel to the humerus. And my second reading is at 30 degrees. So we started at 5. So she's 5 to 30 degrees. Range of motion measurements for supination is generally 0 to 80 degrees. All right, so client position in sitting, humerus adducted, forearm in neutral position. Client will be holding onto a pen. Okay. Next, I'm going to go ahead and find my my bony landmark, which is the third metacarpal. So once I find that, I'm going to go ahead and retrieve my goniometer for my first reading. So my first reading is at 0 degrees. So I'm going to keep my hand on the bony landmark, and I'm going to go ahead and stabilize at the humerus proximal to the joint being measured. And I am going to go ahead and ask you to turn your hand, your palm should face your face. Okay, I'm going to keep my hand on my axis point. Stabilization is no longer needed, so I'm going to go ahead and remove my finger. Okay, so the stationary bar will be parallel to the forearm, and then the movable bar would be parallel to the pen. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the goniometer for my first reading. My first reading is at 90 degrees. 90 degrees of supination. And for pronation, client positioned in sitting, humerus adducted, forearm at 90 degrees, neutral position. All right, next I'm going to go ahead and find my bony landmark, which is the third metacarpal. Once I find my bony landmark, I'm going to go ahead and retrieve my goniometer. Place the fulcrum of the goniometer on the third metacarpal for my first reading. My first reading is at 0. I'm going to go ahead and put my finger back on the axis point. I'm going to go ahead and stabilize. All right, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to turn your hand down. Okay, once you turn your hand down, I am going to go ahead and retrieve my goniometer. All right, so the stationary bar will be parallel to the floor, and the movable bar will be parallel to the pen. And my first reading is, I'm getting around 82 degrees of pronation. Thank you. Range of motion measurements for wrist radial deviation is generally 0 to 20 degrees. Humerus adducted, forearm pronated on table, fingers relaxed. Next, what I want to do, I want to go ahead and find the bony landmark, which is the dorsum of the wrist. Once I find the bony landmark, I'm going to go ahead and place my goniometer for my first reading. Now the stationary bar is parallel to the forearm. The movable bar is parallel to the third digit of the metacarpal. And my first reading is at 0 degrees. I'm going to go ahead and replace my hand back on the axis point. And I'm going to go ahead and stabilize proximal to the joint being measured. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you to turn your hand all the way in towards your body. Good. So I'm going to remove this hand because stabilization is no longer needed. I'm going to place the fulcrum of the goniometer on the axis point. Stationary bar again, parallel to the forearm. Movable bar is going to be parallel to the third digit of the metacarpal, and my reading is at 20 degrees. 20 degrees of radial deviation. Range of motion measurements for distal interphalangeal flexion is generally 0 to 80 degrees. Client is positioned in sitting, elbow at 90 degrees, forearm midpoint position, wrist positioned in neutral. Next, I'm going to go ahead and find my bony landmark, which is the DIP joint. Once I find my bony landmark, I'm going to go ahead and place my goniometer. The stationary bar is proximal to the middle phalanx, and the movable bar is proximal to the DIP joint. So I'm going to go ahead and keep my hand on the access point and stabilize proximal to the joint being measured. Go ahead and bend your finger all the way in. All right, so stabilization is no longer needed, so I'm going to go ahead and move this hand. And I'm going to go ahead and reapply the goniometer to the access point here. All right, so my measurement here is, I'm getting 15 degrees of flexion. Thank you. Wrist ulnar deviation is generally 0 to 30 degrees. Client positioned in sitting position, humerus adducted, forearm position in pronation, fingers relaxed. Next, I'm going to go ahead and find my bony landmark, which is the dorsum. Okay, once I find my bony landmark, I'm going to go ahead and place my goniometer on the access point. Okay, so the stationary bar is parallel to the forearm, and then the movable bar is parallel to the third digit. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take my first measurement. I'm going to keep my hand, put my hand here back on the access point, and my first reading is at 0 degrees. All right, so I am going to go ahead and stabilize proximal to the joint being measured. And I'm going to go ahead and ask you to move your hand towards your pinky finger. Okay, so now stabilization is no longer needed, so I'm going to go ahead and remove this hand. Place my goniometer back on the access point, which is the dorsum of the wrist. All right, so the stationary bar, again, it is parallel to the forearm. Movable bar is parallel to the third digit, and my reading is 60 degrees. Range of motion measurements for wrist extension is generally 0 to 70 degrees. So first thing, client positioned in sitting, humerus adducted, forearm midpoint position. Next, I want to go ahead and find my bony landmark, which is the radial styloid. So once I find my bony landmark, I'm going to go ahead and place my goniometer on the access point for my first reading. Now, the stationary bar is parallel to the forearm, and the movable bar is parallel to the second digit of the metacarpal. Okay, and my first reading is at 0. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the goniometer. I'm going to stabilize proximal to the joint being measured, And I'm going to ask you to bring your wrist back towards me. All right, so my stabilization is no longer needed, so I'm going to go ahead and remove my hand. All right, I'm going to go ahead and put the goniometer on the bony landmark here. Okay. All right, so my second reading is at 60 degrees of wrist extension. Thank you. Range of motion measurements for metacarpal flexion, which is generally 0 to 90 degrees. All right, first, client is positioned in sitting, elbow flexed, forearm midpoint position, wrist in neutral. Next, I want to go ahead and find my bony landmark, which is the MP joint. Once I find my bony landmark, I'm going to go ahead and place my goniometer on the axis point for my first reading. So the stationary bar is parallel to the metacarpal, and the movable bar is parallel to the proximal phalanx. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and keep my hand on the axis point. My first reading is at 0. And then I'm going to go ahead and stabilize proximal to the joint being measured. So go ahead and turn your finger all the way in. So I'm going to keep my finger on the MP joint. Retrieve my goniometer for my second reading. Okay, relax. So my second reading is at 65 degrees of flexion. Range of motion measurements for proximal interphalangeal flexion is generally 0 to 110 degrees. Client is positioned in sitting, elbow at 90 degrees, forearm at midpoint, wrist in neutral. Next, I'm going to go ahead and find my bony landmark, which is the PIP joint. All right, I'm going to go ahead and place the fulcrum of the goniometer on the axis point. The movable bar is proximal to the phalanx, and the stationary bar is to the middle of the phalanx. All right, so my first reading is at 0 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and stabilize proximal to the joint being measured. And I'm going to go ahead and ask you to bend your finger towards you as far as you can go. All right, great. I'm going to go ahead and place the goniometer back on the finger, on the joint being measured. And my reading is at 95 degrees of flexion. 95 degrees of flexion. Thank you. Range of motion measurements for wrist flexion is generally 0 to 80 degrees. First thing I want to do is position. So my client is positioned in sitting, humerus adducted, forearm position at midpoint or in midpoint position. Next, I want to find my radial styloid, which is my bony landmark. So I'm going to go ahead and look for that area. Once I find my bony landmark, I'm going to go ahead and place my goniometer on the axis point for my first measurement. So the stationary bar of the goniometer, it is parallel to the radius, and then the movable bar is parallel to the second digit of the metacarpal. And my first reading is at 0. All right, so what I want to do, I want to keep my finger on the axis point, and then I want to have, I'm going to stabilize proximal to the joint being measured, and I'm going to go ahead and ask you to bend your fingers or your wrist towards you. Good. So you want to make sure you keep your finger on the axis point, and I'm going to go ahead and place my goniometer. Okay, and my second reading is 75 degrees. Thank you.